Welcome everyone. On behalf of the Japanese American Museum of San Jose, I want to thank you for coming this afternoon for a very special program we're doing in commemoration in honor of Women's History Month. My name's Chizu. I'm on the advisory board for the Japanese American Museum. And I think probably most of you are pretty familiar with this place, but those of you who aren't, besides the exhibit downstairs, which I'd encourage you to see, they have a lot of programming here, like tons of stuff. The whole month is filled. And I think at the end of this program, before you go, there'll be an announcement about the upcoming programs. Also, you can become a member if you're not a member. And you can donate money, lots of money if you want as well. Okay, now that I got that part over, I want to tell you that I think this afternoon we're going to have a very interesting program. And it's a real honor to introduce the facilitator and one of the panelists. This is Susan Hayase, here to my left. And she has been an activist in the San Jose Japanese American community for many, many years, especially involved in the redress movement, the movement to win redress reparations for Japanese Americans in the World War II internment. She was the chair of the Nihon Machi Outreach Committee, which was an organization involved in that movement. And she also was appointed by President Clinton in 1996, I think, to serve on the Civil Liberties Public Education Fund Board. And that was after the redress victory. That was one of the results of the reparations, was to have a community fund board to fund educational programming. Besides that, she also worked full-time as a research R&D engineer in Silicon Valley for almost 35 years until she retired. And so without further ado, I'll have Susan Hayase here introduce the panel and the program.
Thank you. I want to thank the museum for giving me the opportunity to do this program in honor of Women's History Month. In honor of Women's History Month.
You need the volume up a little bit more? Did everybody hear all right?
Yeah, I probably just wasn't close enough. Huh? International Women's Day was last Sunday, March 8th, celebrating women's economic, political, and social achievements. And I hope that everybody takes the opportunity this month to learn something about women's history. It's traditional to honor famous heroes of women's struggle and achievements, and to acknowledge the first woman to do this or that, and to learn from women who are breaking glass ceilings and heroically breaking into leadership roles or blasting off into outer space. But this program is a little bit different, but not because our guests aren't playing significant roles. We wanted to explore something more offbeat and possibly more hidden, the kind of thing that may be difficult to distill into a factoid. Basically, what are the factors that have shaped identity for Japanese American women, past and present, and what lessons are useful to pass down? To do this, I want to explain the title of the workshop, which is not a typical Nisei. During the course of the redress movement, when talking about the specific experiences and views of different Nisei, many would apologetically say that they were not typical Nisei. And so many people said this that it kind of became a thing to many of us. And sometimes it seemed to reflect a hard-fought position of identity, separate from a stereotype. Sometimes it seemed to be a criticism of other Nisei. Sometimes it seemed to be an apology for violating the norm. But ironically, this feeling seemed to be typical. Typical, okay. So I think it's kind of a central element of Japanese American identity, and that's what we'd like to explore. And here to help us explore this, based on their personal experiences, are filmmaker Emiko Omori and her sister, journalist Chizu Omori. I'm going to give you a little background on both of them. Emiko, sitting on the far right, is an award-winning cinematographer and director who's worked on more than 20 films, including several award-winning documentaries. She began her career as a filmmaker and cinematographer in 1968 when there were few camera women and fewer still Asian American camera women in the United States. Her films include Rabbit in the Moon, Passion and Power, The Technology of Orgasm, and Ed Hardy, Tattoo the World. In 2000, Rabbit in the Moon won an Emmy Award for Outstanding Historical Programming. Chizu, who's right here on my right, was raised on farms in Southern California and incarcerated for 3.5 years in Poston. After graduating from the University of California, Berkeley, she married and raised 2 children. She then moved to Seattle, where she joined and became a plaintiff in the class action lawsuit for Japanese American redress sponsored by the National Council for Japanese American Redress, or NCJAR. Omori is a freelance journalist, and she's written for the International Examiner and is currently writing for the Nichibei Times of San Francisco. She co-produced the documentary Rabbit in the Moon with her sister. I have, the format of this program is very informal. So we're going to have discussion. So I hope these questions that we're going to be addressing spark memories or thoughts that you might have had about your own identity, and we really welcome participation by everybody here. But we're going to start with some questions, and Emiko and Chizu are going to help discuss these. And some of the questions will, the answers might be facilitated by some clips from Rabbit in the Moon. Okay. So I think maybe the first question to ask, to put this in context, is Emiko and Chizu, tell us about your family of origin, and in what ways was it a typical Japanese American family, and what impact did your parents and siblings have on your identity as a woman and a Japanese American? And what kind of expectations did you have growing up in terms of growing up female?
I don't know if we really need this. I suppose we could just talk loudly. Well, Chizu and I been giving a lot of thought to all this, and once again, here's this word "typical," whatever that means actually. One of the reasons that I felt that using Rabbit in the Moon might be a way to spark discussion is that she and I thought a whole lot about a lot of the questions that Susan gave to us to make this movie. And one of the things that I think has impacted us, in fact at lunch we were talking about it, she and I, by the way, I also spent 3.5 years in camp and grew up on a farm. But it was like 2 different experiences of growing up. Her growing up was pre-war. Of course, she did grow up after the war, but she has longer experience with pre-war Japanese American community that we were part of down in Southern California, in northern San Diego County. My kind of conscious experience of the Japanese American communities after the war, which was like totally different, destroyed, wrecked, fragmented. In fact, we didn't really have much of a community. So within our own family, we have these 2 very different experiences. Our mother died shortly after the camps, so she kind of had even a different mother. Then I had a stepmother and another set of family that came along afterwards. She left camp before we got out. She went on to finish high school in Los Angeles with a dear family friend, Nisei Yamamoto. So she wasn't even kind of living with us when we came out of camp, and we went off back to a kind of very hard scrabble, poor family farm back to Southern California, which was prospering among, in terms of our farm community. We were doing well. It was like a little Japanese village that had moved there, and so there was this cooperative. They pulled their money and bought tractors and seed and all that together. They had a bank account with about $10,000 in it, and then the war, and gone, because we also didn't own the land. We just were leasing the land. So it was, and that all kind of came to be, I mean, this thinking, because Chizu and I, we do admit this, and actually we admit it in the movie, we never thought about the camps after the camps, that was that. But it was Redress that got Chizu thinking about it. I had just finished a movie for American Playhouse based on 2 short stories by Nisei Yamamoto called Hot Summer Winds. That experience was interesting in this way. I don't know if you're familiar with it or her stories or whatever, but anyway, it's about pre-war Japanese American community, and a husband and wife, they're having kind of like, marital problems due to class and the Americanized children and all that stuff. And every time I would mention to people that I had made a movie about Japanese Americans, they always just said, the camps? A camp movie? So I realized that for the American kind of common thought, we sort of didn't exist before the camps. Kind of like, where were we? Or, So, so that was a kind of a revelation for me that, I mean, we knew we were there, but that other people had never even, like, they didn't know we were like this prospering community. They just only know us from the camps. So, so that's one of the reasons in Rabbit, it was very important to show a vital community before the camps. And there's all that wonderful home movies of people playing golf and driving their great cars and having big picnics and things that I never experienced in my, when I was growing up. And Chizu, I don't know if you were experiencing then.
Oh, well, yeah, I guess that model of the little cooperative, Oceanside Farmers Cooperative Association, I remember that because, they had one of those labels made that was put on strawberry crates and that kind of thing. Yeah, and that community built a little schoolhouse or community building. They hired Japanese school teachers that actually came from Japan, and we went to Japanese school every day after American school. So it, was a small little Japanese community going on there, whereas in the American part of our lives, we were few in the school, so that it wasn't like we, stood out as far as being a group is concerned. And so I never felt any discrimination as a small child. In fact, if anything, I was a petted little girl because I was smart, and the teachers were always saying, I was elevated as to be teacher's pet and that kind of thing, just because I was a smart little girl. Smart ass too, probably, I don't know. Anyway, so, I had this kind of self-confidence, an unconscious sort of thing, because I was so accepted, by all the, the 2 different lives that I led, essentially. So, it's interesting. I used to say things like, oh, I have 2 communities that I come from, and I can choose the best of both communities, to live by. Well, then there's the dark side of each community that I also had to live by. But, I don't want to get this conversation just about us, because this is really, I want everybody to participate. So, Japanese American identity is a pretty complicated thing. It's complicated, but then it's a kind of also, when you want to use the word typical, an immigrant experience in the United States. That is, most everybody, their family, immigrated to the U.S. at one time in their history, and they had to go through transitional periods of adjusting to the new society and culture. In our case, I think the ties to the homeland of Japan were pretty close, because if you see all of these photos of people with their finery on, wedding portraits and family photos and stuff. I think a lot of those portraits were done to send back to Japan so that the relatives in Japan could see how well we were doing and how prosperous we were. And, in that sense, studying these photos are very interesting because you have farmers wearing tuxedos and, girls and, real great clothing and all. Yeah.
Just an aside, I've seen these photos too. Little infants, they're not wearing like diapers or anything, just to prove that they have a son.
A male child.
Yes.
Oh. Yeah.
I've seen those, they're quite hilarious.
Yeah, So pre-war, there wasn't this feeling of divide somehow. I mean, we knew that, it was two different communities, but it didn't matter. It did not interfere with just getting along and going along and all that. And really, it was the camps that was the big traumatic event in Japanese American lives that made us question who we were, where our loyalties lay, and oh well, that's a big subject.
Okay, so can I do a clip? Or do you
Oh,
want to
I just want to ask a question of the audience.
Oh, okay.
So I'll just speak really loudly. Can everybody hear me? I was just wondering whether anybody in the audience had a similar experience of being in a benevolent and non-hostile Japanese community or in a more integrated community. You want to raise your hand if you, yeah.
I grew up in LA, and it was interesting. When I went to started school, I went to Mario, which was a Catholic school, but most of the student body was Japanese.
Oh.
And so my parents sent me there, and then church, I went to a Union Church in Los Angeles, which was the same thing as Presbyterian Church, but most of the congregation is Japanese American or Japanese. And so I lived that life until I hit 4th grade. And then from there, I went into the so-called public school system. And yeah, it was kind of a shock for me. I think my mother said when I first came home, the first day from school, she said, "Oh, I came home and I was so excited." I said, "There's Japanese with blonde hair." So I was very sheltered for a while. Yeah.
Is there anybody else that had a different experience growing up in a more hostile environment where you were felt that being Japanese American was a negative thing that you had to deal with?
I think before the war, we were more or less in Mountain View anyway. We had so many Slavonians, Spaniards, Japanese. I don't remember too many Chinese in the school. But we all got along as equals, and we kind of admired each other's lunches because they were very different. And I don't know, I don't remember any discrimination. It all turned up, and we became more aware after the war when we came back. That people started to categorize us differently. Before the war, we were all together, and we had the Portuguese fiesta and all the parades, and everybody got into their costumes and paraded down Castro Street, and it was a lot of fun growing up in those days.
I'm a Sansei, and so my parents were at Topaz. But just talking about the different communities you grow up in, my family went to a Japanese American church in Oakland, which actually had an English service and a service in Japanese for the Nisei. And we had, undokai, the big annual picnics in Mosswood Park in Oakland. So that was a big part of my, sort of cultural identity, I think. But we lived in a white neighborhood in North Berkeley with, where we were very few Japanese Americans. And my father had a grocery store in formerly Italian, but then later Black American neighborhood, which is where the headquarters of the Black Panthers were. And so all of our customers were African American. So I remember thinking, shifting gears, with the white professors' kids in Berkeley and the Japanese American church on Sunday, and then going to our store where there was a Chinese American and a Japanese American grocer, so it was sort of like I grew up being called all kinds of names. And so I remember thinking you have to sort of switch gears every time you move from place to place.
Yeah, my mother grew up in a situation similar to yours in the country where there were not too many Japanese Americans. But my father grew up in South Central LA, which is kind of the store situation. They had a store. So, so I think there's a lot of different experiences. But what do you think? You want to show a clip?
Can I intro this?
Yeah.
So kind of apropos of this very thing we're talking about, this clip that I'm going to show you is really around the questionnaire, which it was this, you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. We weren't allowed to marry out and blah, blah, blah. So here we are, our little ghetto things. And then, you're sending money back to Japan. You're trying to learn the language in case you have to, since you're all going to go back someday or something. And, in camp, along comes this questionnaire, which now punishes you for everything they have made you do outside. They punish you for speaking the language. By punish, I mean the questionnaire was graded. And so, points were taken off if you spoke the language. If you were Buddhist, points were taken off. And yet, we hadn't been able to break out of that. They wouldn't allow us into the wider community. So it's just one of the most divisive things that happened in camp and still haunts us to today. So I'm going to show this section on the questionnaire because it will answer, I think, or at least open discussion for some of the other questions here, which is like how we became activists. The difference between our mother's Kibe, but very Japanese because she had spent really her developmental growing up time in Japan and was a picture bride.
Not technically, but...
Oh, not technically,
okay.
She says. I don't know.
But
Anyway,
it was an
but it was
arranged
arranged. Let's like,
Arranged
I guess
marriage.
it was an arranged marriage. Anyway, so you get a little of this background in this, and so I'm going to play. Okay, this is the TV. No, this is that. Okay. All right. So. And we made this movie back in when did we finish this? 1999 is when it came out. Let's see. It was, heck. Okay. I had just finished making this dramatic film called Hot Summer Winds, and Chizu had been working on redress because I made Hot Summer Winds in 1990, and had learned. Well, why don't you tell them about how you came to learn about the questionnaire, which we thought we knew about it, and then you started to study it, and you discovered all these things that we really didn't know it.
Well, I have to say that so much in life is accidental. It's just a fluke. And, okay, my relationship with the JACL is not cordial. But anyway, I was in Seattle, and I was working with the JACL group up there on the redress project. And at one point, they said, we would like a report on the questionnaire. Well, why don't you do it? Oh, no, you do it, sort of thing. And so I got asked to do that. Well, I asked my friend Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga, if you know redress history at all, she is a pivotal figure, a very, very important figure. But she, anyway, she has a lot of information, a lot of documents and stuff. So she sent me copies of the questionnaire, her own and a few other people's questionnaires. And then she sent me all these other documents about how these questionnaires were graded and how people were sorted out into various categories of, you know, a continuum of loyalty, disloyalty. You know, the categories were called black, brown, tan, no, black, tan, no, wait a minute, I'm sorry, white, tan, brown, black, you know, that kind of thing. I mean, it is just so ludicrous when you look at it, you know. But then they had a whole lot of trouble grading people because, you know, this or that, or depending on who was looking at it, like a, you know, a soldier or a civilian or what. This is a fascinating history, but at any rate, so it was like, nobody knows about this, you know. It's thought, this is terrible, all what they did to us. So that's how I got involved in the questionnaire thing.
Okay, so now I'm going to play the clip.
When the questionnaire reached our camp, Poston, the government had realized the folly of Question 28, which asked our Issei parents to give up allegiance to Japan. The question had been changed so that my father could answer yes without losing his Japanese citizenship. But by this time, our parents had decided that they no longer wanted to stay in the United States. Our father requested repatriation to Japan. This automatically put our whole family into the disloyal or reject category.
They felt that there was no future for them here, that they'd been treated so poorly, and that there was family holdings in Japan, and that they would prefer to return and rebuild their lives in Japan. Now, this was very devastating for me personally. I was like 13 years old. I think I protested very loudly, and when I would say, well, I'm not Japanese, I'm American. And my mother would say to me, well, if you're an American, what are you doing here in this camp, you know? Oh, I couldn't answer that, of course. It's just that I could never become a Japanese woman. I know that. I would be such a misfit. And the way I knew that women were going to be treated in Japan, namely, I would have to be like someone like my mother, and I did not want to become someone, or be forced to become someone like my mother. That's the honest truth. Our mother was educated in Japan and had really absorbed the traditional cultural values of Japan. So she had her role, as she perceived it, as being this Japanese wife. Now, my mental image of her was a person who walked 3 paces behind her husband and her eyes cast to the ground and just putting herself last, whether eating at the table or, you know, the last of everything. And in my American way, I really thought that was stupid, to be honest. And I used to tease her about it. I knew that she got married when she was 16, and I used to say, oh, you were just a child bride, you know, and make fun of that kind of thing about her. So we didn't get along too well because of these culture clashes, basically, and temperamental clashes also. She thought I was too outspoken, too loud, too, brash. Whereas our dad, who was much more easygoing, he was more Americanized than our mother, a lot more, even though he was educated in Japan too. So I went through a long period of fighting with my parents, of trying to figure out some way that at least I could stay in this country. And I was just a feisty enough kid to think, well, somehow I'll find a family to take me in or something. I don't know. I really tried. I wrote letters to magazine editors and all kinds of things like that, just saying, is there some way that I could, be allowed to stay? And I got my parents into trouble over writing letters like that. They got hauled in to the administration offices and questioned about this because people would be saying, "What's going on?"
Wow.
So it's painful to see this kind of stuff. Well, anyway. Is there something you want to?
Oh, so anyway, it was just this thing. One of the questions was how to become activists. I don't know how she became an activist. She must have become an activist at the age of 6 or something like that. And then somehow it filtered. I'm not an activist the way she is. And this is the way my activism is. I make these kinds of things. But she goes out and, pickets and things like that, which I don't do. Anyway, this is the origins of our activism.
But I think that's so moving, that letter where she says, "Please help me," and she's writing to all these people. It's so moving because actually, Chizu, you weren't an activist, really. You were just a child, right? You're just a normal person, but you had a lot of sense of self, and you had a lot of gumption, but you had a lot of need too. There was a need behind that, and I think, so the reason why we wanted to talk about this kind of stuff is because a lot of times we do talk about people who are already, the first elected official, whatever, or somebody who is the CEO of a corporation, and we just assume that there's something so different about those people in essence, right? But and a lot of times people think, oh, I could never do that. I could never be like that. I could never be a leader. I could never, do what those people did. But I think these kind of stories show, the deep human feelings and initiative and budding leadership that even children have, and so it's very inspiring, and it's something that I think everybody could really relate to. It's easy to relate to. It's so hard to relate to the billionaire CEO or whatever, but I think if you think about what do we want for our children, we want our children to be smart enough and free enough and have enough gumption that they could do what Chizu did. Anyway.
Well, I would like to go back to the issue of the typical, well, when I say typical Nisei. All right, well, what is meant by that, I'm assuming that it means that there's a large bunch of people who act alike or think alike or something like that. And within the Nisei community, I can see why they might say, well, I'm not really a typical Nisei, but there's got to be some kind of image of what a typical Nisei is, and that they aren't that.
Well, what is that then? So what is a typical Nisei? Is it the stereotype? I think maybe people have this stereotype in mind, and that's the typical Nisei. And on some level, nobody can relate to that. But where does it come from, and what is it? What defines the typical Nisei? Does anybody else here have an idea of what is a definition of a typical Nisei?
If you go to Japan, they have a totally different idea than we do about the typical Nisei. Because I don't know if you remember, Ronald Reagan made a gaffe. It got interpreted by the Japanese in Japan in kind of a funny way. I don't know if you remember that incident or not. But it was, they're familiar with Nisei that, Japanese Americans, second generation, who go back to Japan just for visiting or for as tourists or for actually business purposes, if they're import-export business or whatever. And so they have, if you ask a real Japanese person, Japanese citizen, they'd have a totally different,
Well,
what
what is
typical Nisei is.
What is there?
Oh, I don't know, I'm not Japanese. I don't know.
It's hard to define.
Yeah. You had something on the tip of your tongue, Eiko. Why don't you, what do you think a typical Nisei is?
I guess to me, a typical Nisei would be, Nisei, right?
Yeah.
Would be someone who kind of absorbs some of what the Issei people did and said. And so, so typical. It's really hard to
Like
define.
traditional? Like traditional?
Yeah. Of course, when you get married, then you try to put the spouse before yourself, and then, of course, you take care of your own children. But see, like in my own personal situation, I happen to be the oldest of three. I had two younger brothers. One was 2 years after I was born, and then the other one was 6 years. So there was a wide gap there, but I became the mother role to my youngest brother because when he was born, it was a situation whether my mom would live or my brother would live, and as it turns out, both of them lived, which was good. But in the meantime, then my mother became a hypochondriac, so I was the mother figure in the family, and so when we visited different friends, and they were all mostly Isseis, then I kind of absorbed some of the characteristics of a typical, there I go, typical Issei, you know, and one was to be respectful to the elders and be thoughtful and the old adage of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, kind of a thing. And so, when I say typical, I think it's part of carrying on some of what characters the Issei people did, and then myself as a new bride, new mother, tried to establish some unity within the family, you know, that kind of thing. And I think majority of people, Niseis who got married, I think they kind of carried on that part of those things. I think, I don't know, maybe I have not been exposed to many situations, so it may not be true. I don't know. But for just from my own personal thing, that's how I would observe it. And I don't know if that would be typical or not.
Maybe, from what you're saying, it sounds like maybe one conception of a typical Nisei is a Nisei who carries out the desires and expectations of an Issei. You think
Yeah, I
maybe?
guess that's part of it, yeah. Because then I would be considered the old Nisei. I'm an old Nisei, see. Because I'm in my 90 already, so I should be an old Nisei. And then the younger folks would be, 40s, 50s kind of thing. I don't know.
I'd like to talk about my experience as far as discrimination as such. I went to trade school, in I graduated high school here in San Jose. They had trade school then. And when I graduated, the rest of my fellow students went down to Union Hall, got the card. But I went down there to get my card. They said, you Japs, get out of here. We don't allow Japs in the Union. So that's the first, harsh discrimination I received, because in Berryessa, I was doing some research. People want to know how many people live in certain communities. So I took Berryessa, that's where I lived. And by chance, I went through every grade school, every grade I went through, there were 50% of those Japanese in Berryessa. So the discrimination was not there. You know, we stood our own grounds, and we were well respected at the school. Then when this happened, but anyway, I'd come back from camp a short time. I went to Los Angeles, and I was working for Hayward Homes, and they were building prefab homes. And there's three of us. We used to put up a house. Every third day we finish a house. We keep on moving. So I never met the man himself, so-called the owner of Hayward Homes. By chance, I had to go in the office one day, and you want to know who I was and so forth. So he says, I'm a Jewish guy, and if I use my name as a contractor, I'll never survive because it's not common for Jewish people is the contracting business. So I use Hayward Homes. I said, if you ever do any business, use a fictitious name. So after I left them, I came back to San Jose in the late it was 1960, and I started a commercial cabinet, building cabinets for restaurants and so forth. Not residential work, all commercial work. And I was doing pretty good. And by going with a fictitious name, I used the North store fixtures. And I was putting in every other week, I was putting in Denny's restaurant. They would start going up, I was doing Army, Navy, NCO club, and so forth. But then the union saw me getting bigger and bigger, so they want to put squeeze onto me because I was getting to be one of the bigger cabinet shop in the Bay Area. So somehow they got, well, I thought I was doing civic duty, and I met a guy that was at halfway house and come out of prison. And only way that at that time they were able to release them out of prison that they have a place to stay and a job. So I went to Folsom and I went to San Quentin, interviewed the guys, and I had about 15, sometimes 20 guys working for me. And I set up a different area shop just for them because they were not union ways, and I had a union shop this side here. And they found a flaw in my doing that. It says, union contract says you got to pay union wages, union benefits, and so forth. I said, these guys are just out of jail. They want a job. I know that they can't get out of penitentiary, so I'm helping them out. That's beside the point. Our contract is a contract, and they made me stick to it. You know, almost. So they didn't quite break me then, but then they passed a bylaw saying that I cannot fire anybody that has high seniority. How poor work they did, whatever they did, I couldn't fire. It was kind of shaky. So finally, they closed my doors. So things like that was very successful. I was doing a job far as east as Patuxent, Maryland. You know, travel all over the country doing different jobs like that. But they saw the one way to break me is to stick me for financially, and that's how, you know. So today is way of they worked for Finagle someplace, and later on, I tried it again, and I used a Japanese name. I went into Yama Wood Products. Didn't fly. Didn't get nobody coming in the door. But just at that time, I was in my cabinet shop there. People were doing redress, and a couple of guys came to me and asked me to help out. And I said, I can't help you out. You know, says my business is with Hakushing, 100% Hakushing. And if I told some of my friends that I'm going to go to Washington, fight for my money, get my redress money, I would never got a job next day. They just kicked me out fast as I walked in. So there it is, the pressure that was put on to me was that they could have broke me too that way. Yeah. So sometimes the sanseis were really harsh on the Niseis. Like gardeners, they work all their lives. They struggle when strawberry sharecropping. Finish that up. and they went gardening. And suppose they were doing job in the Los Altos area, and Mrs. Jones, I'm going to go to Washington, march for my redress money. You think, huh? When he comes back and says, I'm sorry, Mr. Sakamoto, you got to keep on moving, you know? So you have to realize a lot of Niseis were in a very, very hard predicament to support you people. And I'm trying to tell them, but they can't understand the Sansei because they've never been in business themselves, you know, depend on other people. You know, depend on yourself, okay, a farmer, you're by yourself, but when you're dependent on the Hakujin business, it's a hard thing to swallow the sin.
Sure, I think a lot of people don't realize how much employment discrimination there was. Starting even before the war, there was employment discrimination. And then after the war, there was a different kind, right? But still a lot of employment discrimination. People couldn't get certain kind of jobs. And then, like you're saying, very blatant anti-Japanese discrimination. So, you know, and I think that's important to work into this formula of not a typical Nisei, because sometimes people, you know, will encapsulate the whole Japanese American history in like 3 points. Oh, immigrants, camp, redress, victory. You know, it sounds so simple, right? But there was, I think it's another way to understand the redress struggle, and that realizing that the whole context, the political and economic and employment context at that time that the movement started was very anti-Japanese. So it's true. I think that, yeah. Did you want to say something?
Well, I was going to say, Jimmy is not a typical Nisei. To me, you're talking about Nisei, you're talking about people who were born maybe about 1920, through 1940 time period. And they're a product of certain ethnic background. For example, all their parents spoke, the primary language was Japanese. Their values were pretty much from Japan. And so they picked up concepts like shikataganai and ishoken, benkyou shinasai kind of thing. And those are the kinds of values that Niseis, most Nisei, it's hard to talk about a typical Nisei, but I think that a majority of the Niseis were in that kind of an environment as they grew up. So that's why I think it was very difficult to get them to initially in the redress movement to start really coming out and spilling their guts about what happened, because it was just not in their nature to be like that.
Okay, let's see. How about for Japanese American women, sexism? Like what kind of a role does sexism play? Like Emiko, you note in your biography that you were probably one of the first Asian American women cinematographers, when you started, right? And Chizu, when you started doing journalism, it was not a common thing for women to be journalists in general.
Well, I'd have to correct a misconception. I mean, I was never a journalist by profession. It's just that I started writing for particularly the International Examiner up in Seattle. And so I've been, writing little bits and pieces for a long time, but it's never been my job, so to speak. Yeah, In fact, writing for the Nichibei Weekly right now, I figure it's a really dream little gig I have here, because I'm allowed to say anything I want to. That's a great luxury if you really think about it. Oh, one thing I also would like to discuss is there is a kind of disparity of perception between the sexes. I think, like male Japanese Americans, well, I shouldn't speak for them, I'm not one after all. But I sort of feel that the women among us, we have been given a softer, well, you know, we're perceived as so, you know, we make great secretaries and all kinds of hardworking and, you know, and all that sort of thing. And we're, I guess, essentially, we're not threatening to the white community. So we're somehow more acceptable. Whereas I think maybe Nisei men had a more difficult time of it. I mean, that's just my general overall perception, you know. Like for me, you know, I just sort of sloughed off my Japanese self and just, you know, went right into kind of like the white community, and it was really easy to do it. I didn't even have to think about it, you know. But I don't think it was so easy for the guys.
Yeah, I think also probably when Nisei were coming of age and entering the workforce, it was probably, I mean, the front lines of entering the workforce were the Japanese American men, right? So a lot of Japanese American women were either, you know, most women were not breaking through into all these different professions, you know, so it wasn't just Japanese American women. Although I do know that, you know, my auntie was a really good student. She took bookkeeping at a community college. This was like right before the war, but nobody hired Japanese American women bookkeepers, so she had to become a maid, you know. So there was a lot of employment type discrimination of, you know, what kinds of jobs you could get.
Before the war.
Yeah, before the war. But also, I think probably after the war, too. I mean, my father was an engineer. He left camp to go to engineering school, and he did really well in school. He was like Tau Beta Pi, which is like, what is that? Phi Beta Kappa for engineers. And everybody at graduation had a job except for him. And he couldn't get a job. He went and shoveled coal for a while and did drafting and stuff like that, because he interviewed a lot of places, you know, who told him, who were polite to his face, but told him they didn't have engineering jobs for Japanese. So, you know, so I think, yeah, I think there was a lot of employment discrimination, but yeah.
Well, just from listening today about pre-war community, Japanese American community, where, you know, you didn't feel discrimination and stuff. So all this is a result of the camps. And being, you know, it's kind of like you went to jail and you're kind of marked forever for, you must have done something bad and all that kind of stuff. So it's interesting, like maybe the war happened, but we weren't shipped off to camps, that you think maybe it wouldn't be quite this way. That, you know, if the camps didn't happen, where would we be today? Which may be that there wasn't going to be this kind of, because it didn't seem like there was this blatant discrimination. You know, maybe behind your back they were, but you know, the larger society, the white society, they had a lot to discriminate against. You know, there were many groups to discriminate against. So I think we just would have been one of those typical groups that would be just thrown in with him. But since the camps, not the war, and maybe because of the war, because it was Japan, although, you know, we were at war with the Germans and stuff, it wouldn't have been this very specific, like your father's case. Because we were kind of speculating, like, what if the camps didn't happen? You know, how would our lives be? I got this job as really not, I didn't start off as a cinematographer, but I started off as an editor on a program called Newsroom on KQED. I don't know if any of you watched it or you were around or whatever. You know, for me, it was kind of like right place, right time. I think what happened was, you know, because now we're talking about late 60s and the 60s. And I think the two men that hired me, one was a black man who had himself experienced, he was a cinematographer, experienced discrimination, and the other was this liberal white guy. And feminism was sort of coming, into being. I did cover one of the very first feminist actions at UC Berkeley when I was doing news, because I did news for a year and a half. It was, when I say just the right time, is, it was that, and affirmative action. That was like a big thing. And when you filled several categories, I was a woman, I was minority, that kind of, because some companies were mandated, or government did that, so I filled 2 spots in their mandate. So that's kind of how I feel I got in. Once you're in, of course, you kind of have to be better than everybody else in order to stay in the game. Because I was up against men, predominantly white men, in the field. But we were such a novelty, because after they hired me, they did hire some other women, that we were kind of seen as, non-threatening, because there were only like 2 of us. And so we were kind of like, oh, look at those girls carrying all that big stuff, that kind of thing going on all the time. I used to work with this kind of large guy, and in those days with news equipment, I had a big camera, and he had a little sound thing, a very small sound. And it was like, whoa, why is she carrying that big, we always got that when we would be out working. And for me, it wasn't like a conscious thing. It was like something like, wow, I like to do this, and I got a job in it. It was just that time where, the Bay Area was this happening place, and this new news program was a very exciting thing that had come out of the newspaper strike that had taken place earlier in 1968, where all the newspapers in San Francisco and maybe even Oakland, San Francisco I think, only went on strike. And so they had this program where all the reporters came on the program and read their news stories. And so it was an interesting time where news was generally presented by one white man, Walter Cronkite, or whoever the other people were on those other stations, reading the news. That was how you saw the news. And our show was live, for one thing, and it was like a bunch of reporters sitting in a horseshoe-shaped table, and a moderator in the middle. And we went out to gather stories, and we did it in a different way than the other news stations, which I knew nothing about. In fact, when I was being interviewed for the job, they said, had you ever worked in news before? And I thought, well, here it goes, I'm gonna lose this job. And I said, no, I'd actually just gotten out of school. They said, great, we don't want anybody that's worked in news. We're trying to get a new look to all this. I was like, okay, And so, like one of my, because I started as an editor, I didn't start out as a camera person, but one of my very first jobs was the man who had hired me, Alan Willis, was in line to interview Huey Newton in jail, and he needed some film. So I, loaded up the car and went across the bridge, and we were waiting. And this is, again, I didn't know how news worked even. And Huey Newton and, what was his lawyer, Garrison, anyway.
William Garrison.
No, whatever his name was, his lawyer. They were sitting in this little room, and they were only allowing one crew in at a time, because, there wasn't any room for more than one crew at a time. And we kept waiting for our reporter to show up, so everybody was, going in. The ABC went in and CBS went in, and it was like, what happened to our reporter who never showed up? There happened to be somebody who was reporting for the Berkeley Bar. We said, would you mind being our journalist? So we went in, and there was no room for all of us, so I ended up having to sit on the lawyer's lap. And because the room, our lenses needed a minimum of 5 feet to focus. And so Alan was scrunched up against the far wall, and we were all kind of mashed in there. So for me, it was just a fabulous time to be working in this stuff. The Black Panthers were going on. There was the hippie stuff going on in the park. There was People's Park. There was a San Francisco State strike with our friend Nisei Hayakawa up there, you know, in his tam and lunatic ravings. We had Alioto was the mayor, and we had this live show, and he was on after us once a week or something. He had a live show. And one time I did a little story about redevelopment. It was a very tiny little visual essay, which we were allowed to do, which was some kind of things that were not being done on any other news station. I mean, I think that's why they wanted us who had not come from news. And it was Justin Herman and redevelopment. They were at that point, I think, destroying Japantown, various other communities. We showed this little film which asked the question, because I had been photographing buildings being demolished. This was not part of my story gathering. We would be driving around doing a story, and we'd go, oh, look, there's another building. I mean, downtown San Francisco just seemed like there were wrecking balls on every block. And so I recorded a bunch of those, and then we showed it, and I just said, what replaced them? I think I got permits. There were something like 380 demolition permits that year or something, and I just said, what replaced them? Well, Alioto was in the other room, and he came on. Let's see, I'm getting two stories mixed up, because what I'm really thinking about the storming moment was when Nisei Hayakawa was on our show, and he got so pissed off that he went stomping out of our show. But Alioto called a special press conference to address this little question. And I was just naive enough not really to know, like, these were points of, when you hit some sort of trigger point, you know, that there's actually some other story going on there, and I should have pursued it, but, well, we had lots of other things we were covering, which during that, when I was there, People's Park happened, and that's when that young man was shot and killed in Berkeley by the, I guess it was the police, I don't know if it was the National Guard. And then at San Francisco State, they brought in the horses. And I didn't cover a lot of the real violent things because they didn't send me out on them. But my colleagues did go out and get tear gassed, and you know, it was a exhilarating time of lots of ferment of all kinds, you know, including like the first be-in in the park. And so I loved working in news. I had an opportunity to move on because, of course, all the other stations needed to fulfill their affirmative action and quotas, you know, and so I did, you know, could work for Channel 5, which is CBS. I did work for them for a day, and I really kind of hated the kind of work that they did. And certainly, ultimately, you know, KQED was known as being sort of liberal lefty. I mean, that's why Hayakawa got so angry at us. He felt that we were biased towards the students. But I didn't really like local news, working in local news, so I didn't go on with it. So then I went on to be a freelance cinematographer. Anyway, I don't know exactly how I got off on all that, but you know, part of it is Chizu was there during all that time too, you know, where activism was just what everybody did. And so that's probably why some of us that's just what you did, you know, and it wasn't like a big leap in any direction, you know.
So how many people here were in the Bay Area during the late 60s, early 70s? Okay. So, you know, I grew up in Orange County, which is famous for being Republican. And I remember meeting people who grew up in this area, Japanese Americans, Sansei in this area, who also had a similar experience where there was a lot of things going on and stuff. But I think there's also, so in some ways that's kind of a typical, there's a typical kind of experience. But then there's also this other alternative typical experience of growing up in a white area, right, where there aren't very many, right, and maybe it's kind of a right-wing kind of area where, you know, just standing there, you're violating community standards, you know. But I remember when I applied to Stanford, and the reason I'm in this area is because I went to Stanford, and they sent me this letter that said, oh, you know, we have this Asian American theme house, you know.
Theme house?
Yeah, you know, because, you know, it was kind of like they had a black students' house, and, you know, so they were, this was, you know, early efforts to help students of color, and there was affirmative action starting to happen, right? Because previous to that, a lot of elite universities were all white, pretty much, you know, and so so I showed my parents this letter, and I said, you know, and so I grew up with mostly white people. I went to Nihon Gakko, but that was only on Saturdays, you know, and we weren't really into it. We really resented giving up our Saturday mornings. But I really, and I was actually very interested in racism because there was a lot of racism where I was growing up. And so I kind of had this feeling like I had to learn what it was like to be with other Asian Americans, other Japanese Americans. And so I showed this letter to my parents, and I said, I kind of interested in doing this. And my parents looked at it, and I remember they were kind of uncomfortable, and they kind of said, you know, maybe that's not a good idea. And so then I said, oh, okay. And so I didn't, you know, and I remember my parents saying these things like, maybe it's not so good when people congregate. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? So I think that's what people were told after camp, right? Don't congregate together and speak your language, you know, right? You know, don't look Japanese. Try to blend in, you know.
You know, it was the application to get out of camp. You had to
Right.
sign all that.
Right.
Leave clearance. Yeah, the leave clearance application. You don't congregate, don't speak your language, spy on your friends. You know, that's a whole list of
Almost
stuff.
like don't eat rice, almost.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so I think there's these different kinds of typical experiences. And actually, when I went to college, and I finally, after my junior year, finally made it over to the Asian American Students Association and met people. And I remember a lot of the people who were in that organization were putting forward this kind of, what they felt was a typical Asian American experience, which was growing up in a people of color community right next door to the African American community and next door to the Mexican American community and urban, you know. So I felt very atypical too, you know, like growing up in a white, conservative, middle class suburb. But then later I discovered actually that that's a different flavor of typical experience. So,
Can I make on that same comment there? 1960, I don't know if you remember, Samuel Shihara, returning veteran, to buy a home near the county hospital there. And the neighbors got up in the arms and said, we don't want no Japs around here. Up to that now, the whole Japan town was a lot of empty lots. They came back, bought the lots, filled it all up. And East Taylor Street off Taylor, 19, 20, 21, 22 Street. They're going to build a subdivision. Hakujin guy said, we'll build for the Japanese because they had no place to go. You know, all the lots are full here. And people went to city council and said, we shouldn't give the contractor permit because it would create a Jap ghetto.
oh.
You know, that's how harsh it was then. But
Where was this?
1960.
Where was this?
Huh?
Which neighborhood was this?
What?
Which neighborhood was it?
It's up there, 20th, 19, 20, 21, 22 Street,
Oh.
off of Taylor Street.
Oh.
North
okay.
of Taylor Street, that was
Oh,
open farmland right there, up to Bayshore Highway, up to Barris Road. That's the area there. So most of them moved in that area. And we were looking for a home ourselves. We were moving around, so we gotta get a place for the kids to go to school. Can't be before we're moving, so we went on the Cambrian Park area there. It's a small 3-bedroom house. And I asked my realtor friend, I think we can afford to buy the house, could you help us along? And he was kind of hesitant, he said, well, I don't know. So he went over there and I told him that the Japanese family wants to move in the house. He says, we don't want them around here. So he told me that. I said, well, let's go one step forward. Let's have them take a vote in the neighborhood. So they took a vote in the neighborhood. By 6 to 7, by one vote, we were able to move in that area.
Wow.
You know, in 1960, we were still fighting the problem then. So, you know, like you people still came a lot later. But us, you know, Nisei in that age bracket there, we had to really struggle to find a place to stay.
Yeah.
To raise the kids in an average neighborhood, sure, be all white neighborhood.
Yeah.
But the struggle went on for quite a while. But things got better because at the time, people got out of college, there were more school teachers, Nisei school teachers, nurses, and doctors, and this and that. And they were more visible in the community doing positive type of work. I think that kind of really helped. And then as Norm then got into up there in my condo, then people started, and like Paul Sakamoto was the first superintendent of school, first Nisei, right?
Yeah.
You know, so people like that were into making names, showing that they were leaders.
Yeah.
Tom, and there was that redlining covenants, redlining in real estate, there were certain areas that people of color couldn't buy or rent or whatever, and the banks wouldn't give you money to be in those areas. And so, of course, then you become a ghetto, right? Because it's the only area that you can live in. So that was, I think the covenants and the redlining, I think that went way into the 60s and maybe even the 70s. I can't remember now when it was struck down.
Stopped, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or even just, even if it wasn't a legal thing, there were a lot of prejudice, right? Like,
Yeah.
Tom, your story about the neighbors were in Cupertino or Sunnyvale. Like, remember you were saying that the neighbors didn't like the people of color moving into your neighborhood in Sunnyvale?
Oh, yeah, I grew up in Sunnyvale, and my father, we moved here in '62, and by that time they had stopped some of the covenants because, my father tried to buy a house in Seattle where he was working as an engineer, and he wasn't allowed to, he got a real estate agent to go look at a house on the phone, and he couldn't see him. I guess he didn't give his name. He said, sure, come over. So he looked at the house, and when the real estate agent saw him, he said, oh, I can't sell you this house. I'm sorry. I just sold the house next door to my best friend. And so in those days, there was no laws against that. Eventually, they moved back here to be closer to the family. My family grew up in this area. And they bought a house in Sunnyvale, and they were allowed to do that. But there were some neighbors who were very worried about it. In fact, there was one, we didn't find out until much later, but a neighbor was getting really worried because there happened to be another Kibe family who already was in the area, and we didn't know him, which was a coincidence. And then there happened to be somebody who was part Chinese and Hawaiian who also lived down the street. So when we moved in there, apparently they were really upset. They were telling all the other neighbors, what's going to happen? Our neighborhood's going down the drain. And then apparently he saw one of my older brothers gets really dark in the summer, and that like flipped him out. He said, oh, now they're moving in. And then apparently a Latino moved in next to him, and that was it. He moved. But we didn't hear any of this until years later. One of our other neighbors was really nice to us. Said, oh, so-and-so, they moved out. You know why they moved out? They said, all you guys are taking over. So I think that was a certain time period, that we're talking about. The shifts were happening because, this area was pretty not was very segregated, but they were starting these mixtures. And I think a lot of it, some of the things people were saying, I think a lot of it had to do with mostly the men in Japanese American families were the ones who were the professionals having the job. And the women, like my mom, they had to kind of not be professionals, just to take care of the family. That was kind of their role. But I think it was really tough until a certain point when they started to break into certain careers, like becoming an engineer or something. That was, like you were saying with your father, that was not really allowed. But at a certain time period, they started to make inroads. And I think that started changing things and started changing some of the neighborhoods. But I had another question to ask, if that's okay. So I was wanting to know from anybody here, as well as the panelists, so my mom, she spent her high school years at Poston internment camp. And one of the things I noticed about her, and I did not have the wherewithal to ask her deep penetrating questions because I didn't know anything. But as she got older, I realized she had very ambivalent feelings about her experiences. And I wanted to hear what other people can chime in about it and explain it. But she really, when she got out of camp, she was one of the first to come back here before her family moved back, and she wanted to go to college, San Jose State. And her parents said, "Why do you want to do that? You're just going to get married. You don't need to go to college." And so she came back on her own, and she worked as a kind of like I don't know what you call it, taking care of a family, taking care of their kids. Yeah, and so that's what she did. So her parents didn't really encourage her. They didn't refuse to allow her to do it. But she was pretty independent, and she really wanted to be a social worker. But then she met my father, who was just coming back from the war. We were talking, Dorothy and I were talking about that. And my father, they're older, all the veterans. And a lot of the Nisei women, they hadn't seen Nisei men for a few years. So she actually told me in different ways that she kind of felt really pressured because she really liked my dad, but she felt like, I don't know if I want to get married. I want to have a career. Then my dad said, well, I'm not going to wait around forever, or something like that. So she got married, and became a housewife. But I always remember there was some ambivalence about this, that she really wanted to do things she didn't get to. And then later in her later years, when we grew up, the kids grew up, she still was trying to pursue some kind of profession, but it got kind of thwarted, probably because I was a brat or something. But I was just wondering about that, because for a lot of the Nisei women, probably slightly younger, there was these kind of ambivalent things. They wanted to do certain things, but they kind of got thwarted because they were supposed to carry on a traditional kind of family life. And I think a lot of the Japanese Americans are just trying to break through. They got to live in Sunnyvale. My dad became an engineer. So I was, I never got to talk to her about it. And so I was just wondering if anybody else had some insight into that.
Well, I remember Mary was always a little bit different from the rest of us who
She
were
wasn't typical.
frivolous. We were just having fun at San Jose State. But she was always so serious, and she always wanted to be a social worker. I remembered that. And whenever we talked to her, she would always stop and not give an instant answer to anything. She would always consider what we asked and give her answer. And I thought, my gosh, she's really a deep thinker. And here the rest of us, we're just flighty things. We just had fun. But I know, to go back to where the realtors were more or less taking us to places where the population would not accept Asians. Well, we saw a house that San Nakagawa built, and we liked it. And it was in a white neighborhood. But the realtors said, they kind of hesitated and said, I'll have to take a poll of the neighborhood and see if they'll accept Japanese family. And so he did. But the neighborhood was just as friendly as can be. And they said, sure. And so we lived there for many years, and we had no problems. So I don't know what it was with the realty board that set such a rule, especially it was an all-white neighborhood, yes, but they were all just as friendly as can be. We had no problems. So I'm glad that I think it's passed now. And The house is still there. Sam built good homes. I'm not.
Well, I was wondering a little about how today's discussion would be going, and it is going all over the place, I see. which is fun and fine. I think, you know, we really don't much get together to talk about these things, you know, and one of the really unfortunate things is that, like with our Nisei forebears and such, that we really did not talk enough about our families, or, you know, how we came to where we were, that kind of thing. And now, you know, as far as I'm concerned, you know, I'm very American. I don't really think of myself much as a Japanese. And, you know, it got me into trouble when once I wrote a column in the Nichibei addressing Irene Hirano, saying that we, the Japanese Americans, should be a bridge between America and Japan, you know, like what she said. Yeah. All right, Irene Hirano had written this thing, and I wrote and I said, well, why should we? You know, we're not Japanese. We don't speak the language. We don't know Japanese history and all that. So I don't see why we're being put upon to be the bridge between Japan and the U.S. And, you know, that raised a huge hornet's nest of controversy, and they had a conference over it and everything. So anyway, I don't identify it very much. And I guess it's really the camp experience that kind of, for me, drew a really clear line. Well, I'm not, you know, that, you know, sort of thing. Yeah, But I want to bring up this little article that appeared in my little newspaper recently, and Selma, Some Personal Reflections and Recollections by George Tsukuda. Now, I don't know him, and he does talk about Selma, but then it's really about his feelings, you know, about his history and all that, and he came up with this very interesting little thing. Let me see, God, I should have, he said he got a doctoral dissertation in clinical social work and interviewed 40 Nisei males who were between 10 and 13 during World War II. Was a tendency to walk as if they were walking on eggshells. In the post-war period, they badly wanted to fit in and also be regarded as law-abiding citizens who crossed all their T's and dotted all their I's. They wanted to be perceived not only as American, but all American, and consequently no longer Japanese. He said that, I can't find it in this article, but he said something on that. They're Americans, but they were closet Japanese. That phrase struck me as terribly funny and kind of sad, you know. Yeah. So I'm a closet Japanese too, in some ways.
How many times per week do you eat rice?
This is, of course, self-delusion. I mean, you know, can you ever think that people don't see you as Japanese and to think you're a closet Japanese? Well, let's see, how much time?
I guess we're kind of coming to the end, but go ahead.
Well, I did want to show the end, but it's kind of a long clip, really, so maybe we will skip it. But because it was sort of, some of you who have Rabbit, you know this, you know, but I mean, it was kind of like after the war, like what happened to the people in our documentary about that. And I think it expressed, I mean, and the stories that people tell, you know, they're just very small stories, again, talking about the effects of the camps. And one that comes to mind is Hiroshi Kashiwagi talking about encountering a fellow Chilean
Emiko, do you want to show the clip?
It's about, well, I can make it shorter than, it is. It's just, I just felt it kind of expressed what people thought about it. Because now when we're making the documentary, it's now like, how many years? Because we started in the 80s. So already away from the camp. So we talked to Mitsuko Shiyama, and I must say, most of these people are gone now, which is sad. So not, there's this sort of underlying thing that I think we don't get to, think about. I mean, for, like being an engineer, I have heard, like, people didn't strive to be, like, say, a doctor. You would be a pharmacist. Now I go, okay, why would that be? Because there's some kind of prejudice about, like, well, you could never be a doctor, but you could be a pharmacist, or maybe a dentist, or a dental hygiene. Like, even your goals were kind of like, well, we'll not try for that, because some psychological thing is saying, forget it, you're not going to get there, So those, to me, are things that are legacy of the camps, kind of our dreams were sort of skewed, and I feel like maybe the generation, people that suffered the greatest would have been those young people, young Nisei, that were just starting off. Like maybe their college was cut short, and they never get back to it when they get back out. They're like, they don't, or some of those wonderful artists who were really up and coming artists, and this comes through, and that's the end of their career, kind of thing, and that, like, I feel like this just was a big detour that came along, and you found yourself on some other track and really never quite found your way back. And well, if you don't mind, I will play it, and that will be, kind of a long clip, but there's some other people in there that I think are important to remember, like Jimmy Omura, who suffered very much at the hands of the Japanese American community when he supported the draft resistors. And I was going to read this letter that he sent, but we'll hear him instead. Where he said it was really tough on him when he went back to he was living in Denver during the war, and he supported the draft resistors in the newspaper. Shoot, I forget the name of his newspaper.
Rocky Shimpo.
Rocky Shimpo, right. And he was shunned by the Japanese American community when he tried to get a job. He couldn't. People talked bad about him. And so he, of course, is a very educated man and ended up working as a landscaper? Gardener. Just like you were saying, you don't go for the top, you start just trying to make a living, and kind of just stayed away from the community for a number of years, and was sustained by a couple of poems that I've shared with Nancy, anyway, that he shared with me actually. But if you'd like to see it, it would, hopefully give you some more things about other people's reactions to the end of the war.
Okay.
Okay, let's see. No, this is the, yeah. Let's see.
The community was barely holding together.
This is the wrong thing.
Families were breaking down. The traditional power structure was broken down.
Stop. Okay, here we go.
When the war ended, some celebrated. Some withdrew into their barracks and would not come out for days. Many had family in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All of us worried about our families in Japan. Some thought it was a trick and refused to believe that Japan had lost. Most of us were relieved, but anxiety filled us, for now we faced yet another uncertain future. One old man hid under a barrack, terrified of leaving. We were allowed only a few days to pack our things and to take just what we could carry. Left behind was the debris of hasty departures, a winter cap, one small red glove, a half-eaten jar of peanut butter. Packs of starving dogs and cats roamed the deserted camps.
But after the war ended and my prison term was over, I came back to Santa Clara Valley. We took any kind of job that was available, picking fruits, working in the fields. And nobody offered us an office job, 9 to 5 with high pay. They just gave us, they didn't give us anything. In fact, we had to scratch for everything we got.
When I returned from camp, or returned from the penitentiary after our reversal, I did go back to the store that we had and talk to the present owners. They had changed hands once. And just for the heck of it, I asked them, how much did you pay for this store? And he says, what do you want to know for, And I told him that, well, we owned it before and we sold it for $1,500. His eyes got that big. He says, yeah, I paid close to $100,000 for it. So, during the war, everybody made money, especially in business. So we would have been probably financially a lot better off than we are now.
America was founded with the idea of resistance to unwarranted government action. And the U.S. betrayed that principle on which this country was founded, not only the U.S., but also the JACL members who welcomed that type of thing, or seemed to welcome it.
I used to keep journals, personal journals in college, and when I look back and read those things, there is no mention of camps, not word one. It was literally erased out of my conscious mind. And I married a Caucasian while I was at Berkeley, and had very little to do with the Japanese American community. I didn't have many Japanese American friends. I didn't visit my family that often. I kind of cut myself off from the Japanese American community.
Being in Tule Lake was you don't dare say that you were in Tule Lake, because then right away, they know that, you were there and you were disloyal and you were a no-no and so forth. So to kind of hide that all the time was a real burden. When we came out of camp, we met this guy who was in Tule Lake not very long ago, and we were going to say hi to him, someone we knew, and he turned the other way and walked past us, and I never forgot that. And I've seen him around, he's still around, but I remember that moment. I never forgive him for that.
I hope that in a not too distant future, that the Japanese American society will be able to come together again. I don't like this gulf between those who are opposed to the JCL and the JCL. I'm not for the JCL because I believe in my heart that the JCL betrayed the Japanese American society. But I think our ethnic society must come together and work together.
Most of the Issei at the time of their incarceration were in their 50s and 60s. I'm now in my 50s, and to imagine losing my home, my car, my job, and to begin all over hardly seems possible. My understanding of what our parents lost, what we all lost, and how hard we all worked after the war is a little clearer now. And why we don't talk much about it is also a little clearer. There was pressure from outside our community and from within to accept the government version of what had happened to us. And far worse things had happened to others during the war. Our incarceration paled by comparison. We felt our complaints sounded petty. At the war's end, we didn't go to Japan. Word arrived from people who had gone that the country was in ruins. There was nothing for us to go back to. So we came out of the camps like new immigrants, with a $25 government stipend to replace all we had lost, and we entered a country now foreign to us. Who were we? Where was our place in this great American family?
I'm just going to cut it short because otherwise it goes on and on. Okay, about how we came back and went back to a farm. We had an outhouse and we did have running water. And I think Frank sort of says it, we probably all would have been better off if we hadn't lost all that. The kind of that what if game. If, as immigrants, we could have bought property and just become part of the American dream. I think we would own quite a bit of Silicon Valley and places of great value now, because that's where we farmed, from those places where nobody else wanted to be. So we would just be in a different place. And the other part of it was, in reviewing this, I'd forgotten what my sister said, because we both kind of fled from the Japanese American community. And we're still not really a big part of it, but for most of our lives, we were not part of it. And this was the first time we thought about it, was making this movie. And it came out because of the redress, I think that's when a lot of people began to rethink that experience. And I kind of resented the fact that, they gave you like 5 minutes to tell them what happened to you. I went, 5 minutes? So first of all, the fact that we had to reiterate, like, a bad thing had happened, and here's some of the bad things that happened. I went, why are we forced to get up and kind of testify in court about, like, I'd been raped again, that kind of, I resented that. But I think what it did do was it did allow people to talk about something that they hadn't talked about. Or Chizu did was she took testimony, people who didn't want to testify, or maybe they didn't have time or something, took testimony. So I think all that is really very valuable. Even at the time, I did think that it was like, why do we have to prove something bad had happened? I mean, it was, again, upon us to say that was bad, and here were all the reasons why. But on the other hand, it did kind of open up the subject. And I think for a lot of the rest of the society, they didn't really know that much about it, or kind of specifics about it, about really what happened to actual people. It was just this thing in your textbook about, that happened.
I want to mention one anecdote, because Tom brought up Boeing, one of my good friends in Seattle named Henry Miyatake was a Boeing engineer, and he is really one of the big heroes of redress, really, from way back. But anyway, the story is that he was a Boeing engineer, and Boeing used to go through periodic layoffs and boom and bust kind of industry. And, you know, Henry was one of a bunch of Japanese American engineers and workers there at Boeing, and they just, you know, got salary cuts or were laid off and went up and down. And they didn't complain, but, you know, they were among the harder workers at the place. And at one point, one of the Boeing supervisors said, "You guys, you really just take it, don't you, you know?" And he said, "Look at you, they put you in the camps, and you guys just took that. You know, you didn't even say anything, you didn't even protest." And just being confronted with all that made Henry really aware of, you know, their behavior, his group's behavior, and he started thinking about, yeah, I guess we did go into the camps and, you know, we just sort of took it. And that started his whole looking into the camps. And I know that he went and studied in law libraries and talked, you know, had a lot of lawyers help him. I think he could have become a lawyer with all the work that he did. But it was just being sort of taunted by the Boeing supervisor that ticked him off and got him going.
So, in conclusion, kind of, you know, it's kind of odd about how I got back to like appreciating Japanese culture. Because having been away from it and trying to not be Japanese, or, you know, and I do have to say, there are still these very Japanese qualities, even among my young friends, of like, you know, bringing gifts, never letting you pay for things and stuff like that, you know, which is, I think, a very kind of Japanese quality. But what, you know, one thing is food. Now suddenly, like when I first came to San Francisco, which would have been 1960, Chizu took me to a sushi bar. I never even heard of a sushi bar. It was a little tiny restaurant somewhere kind of in downtown San Francisco, and it was just, you know, there were Japanese businessmen in it, you know, and, you know, kind of joked about, well, this is never going to take off, you know, raw fish and all that stuff, you know. And so now, of course, like, it's so hip, I mean, you know, so that kind of makes, again, you know, being Japanese sort of okay, like, oh, like, we like your food, and we like ramen, and in fact, the big ramen thing in Japantown was like overrun with people, mostly non-Japanese people, I think, you know, and young people. So, you know, that's been, and that's kind of all over everything now, you know, all the great chefs go to Japan. For me, it started to turn in the mid-70s. And I wanted to get my first tattoo. And someone gave me this article about this guy who was doing these private tattoo sessions. Because I had already gone to one tattoo shop. His name is Lyle Tuttle, and he was right at the bus station, Greyhound bus station, and he walked up and went, oh, I don't think I want to get a tattoo from this guy. And then there was this article about this guy who had a private studio. So I walked into his studio, and to my great surprise and delight, the walls were covered with pictures of Japanese people, men and women, with large, beautiful tattoos. And that's when I got like, gee, I didn't know this was in Japan, and how great. And you know, it was a little kind of out of the norm, out of being, didn't want to be typical, I guess, you know. I was trying to get away from that, you know. And so I struck up a long and very wonderful friendship with Ed Hardy, who was way more knowledgeable about Asian and particularly Japanese culture. And he speaks Japanese. He and his wife, you know, she's like a Sicilian from New York, and he's like a surfer from, you know, Southern California. So whenever we would go to a Japanese restaurant, you know, the waiter, waitress, or whatever would talk to me in Japanese, and they would answer, you know. And through Hardy and really studying the culture and all, and deciding myself to get a large Japanese-style back tattoo was, I think, kind of unconscious, because I don't remember it being very conscious, of wanting to have pride in being Japanese. Although tattoos were kind of a weird way to do it, I suppose, because, you know, at that time you were either
a gangster.
Yeah, gangster, or certainly a lot loose person, or maybe you've been in prison, you know, that kind of thing. So I did get one, and he told me, you know, often they're talismans, you know, it's like they're to give you, it's, I suppose, the equivalent of like wearing a crucifix or something like that, you know, it's something to give you strength. And I can't say it's conscious, but I think it has, you know, like, it's kind of my secret, and I have this wonderful, strong woman, because that's what he said, what would you like on your back? I said, well, I want a strong woman, and I love the sea, and I was born in the year of the dragon, so it's this, you know, dragon with the Amma, the pearl diver, who's fighting off the dragon. And it's really based on a print by a very famous, again, Japanese ukiyo-e print by Kuniyoshi. And all this I learned from him. And it reawakened again my wanting to learn more about the Japanese culture and to be proud of it, that it has a beautiful history of art and culture. And, you know, I always thought, well, every culture is unique and different, and so why would, you know, but Japanese culture is somehow more unique, not typical. Because it took some white friends of mine, my mentor, Chris Marker, and my ex partner, to really, all white people, I might add, that so appreciated the culture and would point things out to me, and I thought, okay, you know, and so it's kind of roundabout, but I've returned to it and finally made a trip to Japan not long ago. Up to that point, it's like, I don't want to go to Japan. You know, there's going to be like those ladies that Chizu talks about, and I don't want to be there and be treated that way. But it's so different now, and excuse me, I'm catching a cold, so I have a little throat thing. Anyway, so maybe that was another kind of unusual way of getting back to my culture. And I was going to show you a clip of that, but we ran out of time of my getting the tattoo.
Now.
Is it someplace where we can see it?
Emiko, you can disrobe right now.
Tattoo City, you got it? I do.
Oh, well, let's see a clip.
Is it, do we have enough time to show another short little clip, or?
Well, anyway, if you want to, this is what I do with it. Oh, see here. See, I don't know, I mean, if you all know about this, you know, that it's mostly the Yakuza that have these big tattoos in Japan. And when I went to Japan, I thought, ooh, can I go to a public bath? You know, because they used to kick those people out.
Especially for women.
Wow. Didn't blink. Nobody cared. Well, first of all, there's that whole thing of being like, ooh, I don't want to disrobe in front of other women. And you know what? Nobody even pays any attention to us. And then you sort of go, okay, and then you know you take off your clothes and you go, oh my gosh, what about my tattoo? And nobody paid any attention, so. things are changing.
There's a lot to do here.
You guys didn't know you were getting this?
Reward for staying with.
We're not typical, are we?
Yeah, this is not a typical.
How do you know that everybody here doesn't have a tattoo?
That's true. Okay, all of you who have tattoos, please raise your hand.
Closet tattoo.
Let's see, this is the side, okay, this is this. So just talk, this is going to be a little while to get this coming up, and I'm going to have to find the spot.
Yeah, I think.
Oops, sorry. Let's see, where's this? Shoot. Oh, here it is. Okay. Okay.
I think it's, with the theme that we have for this discussion, not a typical Nisei, it's hard to sum up. And it's hard to draw a simple conclusion. I mean, I guess the only thing I can say is that there's probably because of the historical experience of Japanese Americans, there is a feeling that feelings of community are really important, but there are reasons why we don't feel like we fit. So we really value the feeling of being together and being in unity and harmony with each other, but there are reasons why we may not, for a variety of reasons. So that's the only thing I can come up with as a conclusion. But you want to show the clip?
Okay, let's see. Inside. Unmute. Oops.
He found an office in a little building on Venice, and it was a 3-year lease. He was fearful that he wouldn't be able to do that, to make it go. So I said, well, let's just give it a shot. You don't know if this is going to work unless you really commit to 3 years. And I worked as a legal secretary to support us. And slowly but surely, he got known. Armistead Mopin had written him up.
No one in my family has tattoos. But when a friend of mine sent me that article by Armistead Mopin, I was intrigued. I found Realistic Tattoo in a nondescript office building. I walked past the mattress store to the end of the hall and opened the door to a world unlike I had ever imagined. The walls had photos of Japanese men and women with exquisite tattoos. The bookcase was filled with art books of all kinds. A polite, curly-headed young man greeted me and my boyfriend. We each got small matching tattoos on our shoulders.
Well, how long does it take to do, say, a large back piece?
Depending on the size of the person and the intricacy of the design, it takes me around 20 to 30 hours work time, maybe a little more or less. And that's usually split up into sessions of anywhere from an hour to 4 or 5 hours duration. I have a lot of clients that come from quite a distance, and some people will come into town and get an entire back scene done in a week's time, and others spread it out over a period of, months or over maybe a year or two.
So you spend quite a bit of time with these people.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, tattooing is a very intimate experience, and you're altering a person permanently.
I didn't get a tattoo until I met somebody that I trusted.
Mm-hmm.
And when I met Don Hardy, I trusted him to do a nice tattoo. And then he and I started talking about moving images and how we both had an interest in moving images. And then I started meeting people with large tattoos, and they were of such a dimension and beauty, and they moved, that it just seemed like I needed to make a film out. I mean, it became kind of an obsession. And then in the course of researching it and meeting a lot of people with large, beautiful tattoos, I got sucked in.
One of the things that appeals to me very much about tattoos, another interesting dichotomy that you find with it is that it's everyone says, oh, they're so permanent. And they are, but they don't have the permanence in the, quote, art world as, say, a Rembrandt or a Michelangelo sculpture. They are only around as long as you're around, and you realize that it's something that you enjoy in this life, and you get them for the here and now.
In the midst of the pain, I thought, this is it. I'm never getting another one. As we were leaving, Hardy said, you'll be back. A couple of years later, I was back, getting a large tattoo based on a print by Japanese ukiyo-e artist Utagawa Kuniyoshi. It's the story of a powerful and courageous woman, the Pearl Diver, who enters the kingdom of the sea dragon to retrieve the pearl that controls the universe.
When we came...
Thank you so much. I had no idea you had a wonderful tattoo like that. Well,
So I guess I would just like to thank all of you for coming on behalf of the museum, and if we could thank our guests who came down here to share their experiences and stories with us, please.